Well, good morning, everyone. It is great to see you and great to be able to kick off this new series today. And as we do, I want to let you know I had the realization that I have officially entered into a new phase of preaching where I don't share stories about my kids anymore. I share stories about my grandkids. So that's kind of where I am right now. And I have a 18-month-old grandson, and his name is Austin. I am at least his third favorite person in the world. So mom and dad are always going to default to one and two. But if they're not around, he wants me. In fact, a lot of times, if even his daddy's holding him, he'll put out his arms for me, and it's just the coolest thing. If I walk in the room, does the exact same thing. But to explain Austin is one of the best ways for me to say it is he is stoic. He's just like this chill kid. Doesn't say a whole lot. Doesn't say very many words. His emotions are kind of like the lows and highs are very close together. I'll even just go as far as to say this. If you know our youngest son, Seth, imagine Seth as a baby. And that's basically who Austin is. In fact, I'm going to just show you a picture. And this is the way Austin looks about 90% of the time. Not happy, not sad. He's just like, he's Austin. He's just there. And so that's where he lives most of the time, unless there is food involved, all right? And when there's food involved, and sometimes the lack thereof, in fact, we FaceTimed last night, and he was hungry, not a kind little individual when he is hungry. But again, doesn't say very many words, but one word he says is yeah. And when food is involved, and he's sitting at his chair and so on, and food comes, he has this yeah, and it's kind of like a giggle, and he starts clapping his hands. So I'll just show you. This is Austin before food, Austin at the arrival of food. That's what we're dealing with, and it kind of reveals to me something very important. There's something very special about food. I'm really amazed at sometimes when I have a meal and like the flavors are fused together that God has given us an incredible gift called food. But there's also something very special about food when we get to share it with another person. There's something special about breaking bread. There's something very special about having a meal together with another person. I don't think it's a mistake that God even kind of pointed to eternity as a great banquet, that we will we'll be taking part in this wonderful thing. I just think about my own family. Birthdays are big, and so birthdays oftentimes are times where we have meals together or a special meal. Tara and I, at least twice a month, will go out on a date night, and always involves a quiet meal. When we travel, and we love to do that, a lot of the planning is around meals. A lot of our memories are meals together. And I think about the big moments in life. I think about, weddings and births and birthday parties and retirements and celebrations and even funerals. Oftentimes, what we are doing is we are sharing meals together. Think about ministry. I get to be there for some of the best times and some of the worst times with people. I know that I've sat across from people at a meal, and I've listened as they've said yes to Jesus for the very first time, which is super cool. And I've been there when people are talking about job promotions and successes and births and weddings and that sort of stuff. And I've been there when people have said, listen, I lost my job, or they're going through financial troubles, or even to the point of saying, listen, I messed up this way. I've even been with people as they've said, I'm dying. And that's a reality in their life. But it has all happened over a meal. Remarkably, some of Jesus' big moments were meals. Some of the big teachings, some of those aha moments in the life of Jesus happened around food. And what we're going to do over the next 5 weeks, I'm actually looking forward to this, is being able to really talk about some of those times Jesus broke bread with people. Some of those times that Jesus was hanging out with people that we didn't expect him to, and the teaching moments that came along with that. I'm looking forward to the Sunday before Easter. We're going to talk about communion, and we're going to talk about the facets of the Passover from the Jewish perspective and that story, and really kind of look at the fact that Jesus is writing a new one. But today we're going to talk about a moment in Jesus' life that many were uncomfortable with. Many were bothered by. We're going to be looking at Matthew chapter 9. We're going to start in verse 9. That's page 814 in the Bibles in the seats in front of you. And again, you're more than welcome with your cell phone to use the QR code. That will navigate you to a Bible app. But as we talk about this, I think it's important to set the stage. And in order to set the stage, we have to talk about taxes. Now, most people don't want to talk about taxes. But there was a profession during the day and age of Jesus, and it's actually interesting that we call them tax collectors, but oftentimes they would call them publicans. And not republicans, but publicans. And publican was a word, actually really two words coming together, public revenue. So a tax collector was in charge of public revenue. And I'll just kind of explain just a little bit of the tax structure and the way taxes were done during the day and age of Jesus by the Romans. One of the things that they had was called the head tax. If you were alive, you had to pay a head tax. And the head tax was, they would kind of say, this is what the average salary is, and every person alive was required to pay 1% of that. Now, when I say 1%, how many of you are good with that? Now, as I say that, it doesn't get any better. Because we think 1%, I'm good with that, but the Romans, well, kind of like what we do, taxed everything. They had a great road system, but the reason why they had a great road system is they created the toll system. And so as you're traveling along, going into a community, out of community, changing roads, there would be publicans at a booth charging. And oftentimes what they would do is they would take and they would look at what you had with you, and they would tax you on that. So if you were carrying goods with you, that was a requirement. There was also, we didn't create it here in America, Romans did it a couple millennium ago, the death tax. So if someone in your family died and you received an inheritance, you would have to pay a tax on that. Customs and kind of a commerce sort of tax was a big thing. So like if you were a fisherman, and that's going to be relevant to us today, but if you were a fisherman and you were at a particular lake and you would dock in a particular area, every time you would dock and you would put your fish like on a cart to carry to market, before you could get out of that area, there was a publican, there was a tax collector waiting. And it wasn't one of those things you did once a year. It was on the daily. On the daily, you came across the tax collector, and he was there to take anywhere from 2 to 5%. Now, here's the big thing with tax collectors, though. They weren't employees of the Roman government. They were contractors. So in other words, they contracted, and whoever had the highest bid is who the Romans would go with. So this particular type of structure was really ripe for extortion and fraud and just outright stealing from people. So that really is kind of important for us today, because the setting of this story is Capernaum. Capernaum was kind of the home base of Jesus, but it was also the home of what we know of the first 4 people that Jesus called into ministry. Peter, Andrew, James, and John were all fishermen. So as they fished on the lake, the Sea of Galilee, every day that they had a catch, they had to pay the tax collector. Day in, day out, week in, week out, year after year, same guy, forking over money to him, knowing that he is stealing from me. And so, Jesus says, hey, come follow me, and I'm going to make you fishers of men. I think one of the welcome reprieves of following Jesus is they didn't have to deal with the tax collector every single day. But I think about that as the story unfolds in Matthew chapter 9. It says that they crossed over to the other side of the lake. They came to Capernaum, right? Jesus healed a paralytic. As he went on from there, they were approaching the tax collector booth. Now, I'm thinking if I'm Peter, Andrew, James, and John, and I don't have to deal with the tax collector, and I'm going to be able to walk by and not have to pay him taxes. Those of you from Albuquerque will understand this. I'm mad dogging them. Okay? I'm walking by like, yeah, that's right. So I have this air of superiority about me. I'm going to intimidate him. I'm going to let him know he has nothing on me anymore because I got a different job now. But in Matthew chapter 9, verse 9, very first part of this is what we read. As Jesus passed on from there, he saw a man called Matthew sitting at the tax collector booth. Now, if you're Peter, Andrew, James, and John, again, think of the relief that you have at that moment as they're approaching the tax collector, knowing he doesn't have the hold on me that he used to have. But also think of the emotions that might be there, thinking, this guy stole from me day after day after day after day. But what we read next, I can't imagine what it was like to be those four. I can't imagine what it might have been like if Jesus had already called Simon the Zealot and Judas Iscariot, because in our terminology, we would call these guys ultra-nationalists. They hated the Romans. They hated anybody connected to the Romans. And what Jesus says very next, it just kind of blows my mind. And it said to him, follow me. And he rose and followed him. Do you ever have a passage that you remember where you were when you read it for the first time? Or where you were when it stopped you in your tracks? I was in a dorm room at Dallas Christian College in 1991. It was the fall. And I remember reading this passage right here thinking, what was it that was going on in Matthew, and what was it about Jesus? Jesus did not say, follow me and I will make you. He simply said, follow me, and Matthew was ready to get up from there. But I'm also thinking, if I'm Peter and Andrew and James and John, and this is happening, and Jesus is stopping, and Jesus is talking to the guy, and Jesus says, follow me, which is the exact same words that he said to me, I'm looking at everybody else going, really? This guy? I mean, we're sinners, right? But that's a whole nother level of sin to call a tax collector into the group. But what happens next? What happens next is even another level of, wow, this is really getting real right now. Notice verse 10. And as Jesus reclined at the table in the house, behold, many tax collectors and sinners came and were reclining with Jesus and his disciples. Now, something invariably transpired between verse 9 and 10. Was it Jesus kind of like doing like he did with Zacchaeus, where he said, I'm getting ready to come to your house today? Or was it Matthew saying, hey, before we start this journey, can I introduce you to my friends? I don't know what, but I want you to know that there's a couple of items here that are really big. One is at the table. Jesus was reclining at the table. That's kind of how they would sit around a dining room table. And so for us, it would be he was sitting at the table. But I want you to notice the word with. With sinners and tax collectors. This word for sin, is not just those that, oops, I messed up. It's almost like these people were devoted to sin. They were completely in. They knew that they were wicked, and they were okay with it. And Jesus was having supper with them. He was hanging out with them. And really what we have to understand in the day and age of Jesus, life was compartmentalized. Like hung out with like. Good, religious, churchy people hung out with good, religious, churchy people. Bad people hung out with bad people. It was very clean, and everybody liked it that way. And so what Jesus did is he kind of crossed the line. He went into enemy territory, and he ate with tax collectors and sinners. And notice what happens next. Notice verse 11. In verse 11, it says, "And when the Pharisees saw this, they said to his disciples, 'Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?'" Why does Jesus do this? It's like, again, like hangs out with like. And so when we think about these people, we think about sinners and tax collectors, it was as if they had a list and they knew that there were people on the list, and these people on the list were on the outside, and they were always going to be on the outside. Now, I don't want to draw comparisons to our culture today, but we all have a list, and we have people who are on the outside, and we have people that will probably, in our minds, always stay on the outside. And so there's just differences here. But I love, they ask the question, why does your guy eat with those guys? Because we look at your guy, and he's supposed to be like us. He's religious, he's good, he does all the right things. Why is he doing this? Why is he doing this differently? And I kind of think of it like this. I kind of think of it as like the religious people, they are fine dining sort of people. They are they're the fine china, salad fork on the left, right? They know all of this. They eat at those restaurants where they bring the dessert tray out to you. And so that's kind of what they're accustomed to. And Jesus is now eating with people that use Cool Whip bowls for salad bowls. You know what I'm talking about? They use Dixie plates, and they use red Solo cups, and they put in red Solo cups what go in red Solo cups, right? And on a good day, they bring out the mason jars, right? And they're like, why is Jesus over there with them? Why is that? And so what Jesus so often does when they're asking all these questions, and they're asking questions, and he's not necessarily involved in the conversation, he's the subject of conversation, he interjects himself. He pushes his way in. And what we find in verse 12 is so cool. Jesus says, but when he heard it, he said, "Those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick." Now, this is one of the more prominent statements of Jesus. But I want you to think about this. Up to this point, Jesus has been teaching. We know the Sermon on the Mount kind of occurred in Matthew, but he had been healing people. And healing people, he's kind of set a standard. And the standard is those who are sick physically are made well by him. And now he kind of changes it and says those who are spiritually sick need a doctor, and that's why I'm with them. That's why I'm hanging out with them. They need to be made well. They need a doctor. And I am that doctor. And let me share, I love ministry. I think I get to do this. But there's been battles through the years. There's been challenges. And some of the greatest battles and challenges have been church members fighting to keep the church as a spa for the spiritually bloated, not a hospital for the spiritually sick. I'll never forget, we did a mission trip when I was in Missouri, a little farm town, and we got back, and I remember a guy standing up in the board meeting. And this particular church, it was in the bylaws, you had to have 4 elders and 12 deacons, and that consisted of the board. And I remember this guy standing up, and he said, I just want you to know that there are a lot of people in this church that believe that our money, and he pointed at the table, pounded on the table, our money needs to stay right here. In other words, we do offering, we do what we do for us and no one else. I'd say 19 years ago. I don't know how many years ago it was. I was in a men's supper one night, and I had just gotten back from, right now the conference is called Exponential. It used to be called the National New Church Conference, but I heard about a church in Chicago that the Saturday before Easter every year they had a car show. And I thought, that's a unique idea. And I got back, and maybe it was because of timing. I don't know exactly what it was, but I was talking to a guy who was a car guy. I'm not a car guy, okay? I'm just going to throw that out. But I said, hey, what if we, on Father's Day, had a car show? And I'm thinking at that point in time, what if we had like 10, maybe 5, 10, 15 cars here? And we just allow the dads at the church to kind of kick the tires and do something cool. And he said, I think we can do that. He goes, I think we can get 10 cars. And it was, I think we can get 25 and 50, and then eventually became 100. And this thing became a really, really big thing. And we don't do this here anymore. There's a lot that had to do with, our focus of ministry and so on like that. But I remember a guy coming to me during this, like the first year, and I had lunch with this guy every week. But I remember him coming and saying, my family and I are leaving because we want to be part of a church that is not so outreach focused. And I knew where God wanted to take us, and I was thoroughly convinced of that. And I'm glad I didn't know it at the time, but when I let people know and the financial director of the church found out, he said, well, just know that 25% of our offering just walked out the door. But God has blessed that. And around that same time period, we began to ask a question. The elders and I studied a book here called The Externally Focused Church, and began asking a question. The question is, if Valley View were to shut our doors and leave the community, would the community weep? I don't know how to quite answer that at this point in time, other than to say a lot of what we do is aimed at helping people outside the church and becoming in contact with people outside the church. And one of the reasons why we do Love Week is that right there. And in fact, one of the biggest wins that I've had in ministry in years happened today, and it happened to do with Love Week. And it's such a cool thing to see. The reality is we're not called to be a spa. We're not called to make people feel good, but to empower people to be out into our neighborhoods and out into our community, because there are a lot of people that are spiritually sick all around us. And Jesus gave us an example of being with them. In fact, what he goes on to say in verse 13 is masterful, because he's Jesus and he's just that way. But he says, go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice, for I came not to call the righteous, but the sinners. And what I desire mercy, not sacrifice. This is from the book of Hosea. And if you read the book of Hosea, Hosea is a message of redemption, and it's a message of a God who is passionately pursuing people who want nothing to do with him. And Jesus says, go and learn. It's almost like he tells the religious people, go back and read the Bible again. Go back and read this again and get this message. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. I don't want your church. I don't want your 15-pound Bibles. I don't want you're going through the motions of religion. In fact, I think one of the things that happened is they maintained the shell, but they forgot the heart. And he said, what I desire is mercy. Now, I'm going to tell you, Kyle preached on this last week and kind of blew my mind. It was one of those things that when we approach Scripture, sometimes we need to be open to conviction. Have you ever been in that part where maybe you're reading the Bible and it's like, man, I wish that wasn't there today because it was really convicting? I had one of those moments. I actually started digging deep into the word mercy. And really the idea of mercy is to offer relief for those who need help. But then there was another thing added to a definition that I was kind of like, I'm good with offering people help, but it also said that there is the action of offering people or giving people relief in need of help with an attitude and desire to do so. Sometimes I help, but I don't want to help. Sometimes I'll do it because I know, well, doggone it, this is what the Bible tells me to do. But I don't necessarily have that heart where I genuinely desire to help people. I will tell you, that's where my wife and I are completely different. Because when she'll say things every once in a while, because this grows from her desire to help people, she's like, I wish we were independently wealthy. And if we were independently wealthy, what we could do is we could help people whenever they needed help, and on and on and on like that. And I'm thinking to myself, yeah, I want a Tacoma and a lot of guns, right? That's what I want. And so I don't immediately go to the desire to help. Jesus said, no, go and learn. This is what I want from you. And this is my heart. This is my heart. I genuinely want to help people who need help. The reason why I came, that's kind of the purpose statement that Jesus makes at the end. And actually, this purpose statement, I love what it talks about in the New Living Translation, kind of how they translate it. It says, for I have come to call not those who think they are righteous, but those who know they are sinners. Those who think. What does that mean? We're all spiritually sick. We all need the healing that only the great physician can give us spiritually. But those who think they're righteous, Jesus can't really do anything with them until they reach that point where they view that they are sick. I love what Luke includes in his story of this in his gospel. In Luke chapter 5, verse 32, he says, I have not come, these are Jesus' words, I have not come to call the righteous, but the sinners to repentance. In other words, what Jesus is desiring to do is not just bring the sinner in, not just invite them into a walk and relationship with him, but he's inviting them to a changed life. And one of the greatest statements I've ever heard in a sermon, and I've used this again and again and again, Jesus doesn't want to leave you where you are. A lot of times we tell people, come to Jesus, but there's also the idea of go and sin no more. Jesus wants us to encounter him, but that result
in a changed life. But as we think about this, again, I want to bring up that one word, with. Jesus ate with tax collectors and sinners. You see, and this is our bottom line, Jesus invited sinners to a changed life by being with them. Conviction on my part right now. I don't have enough friends that are not followers of Jesus. I'm a church guy. I hang out with church people. And the conviction that God has placed on me is that I need more people in my life that have yet to take the invitation that Jesus has to deal with their spiritual illness. And I think a lot of us, we're probably right there as well. That we need people in our lives that we regularly break bread with so that we might be able to. Now, we don't want to do a bait and switch, but we want to be able to give them the invitation that Jesus gives to a changed life and a redeemed life through His blood and His body and His sacrifice. So we think about that. We think about who are sinners. Sinners is a kind of a generic term, kind of a broad term. So I want to go ahead and ask the question, who are the sinners here? Sinners are seekers and unbelievers. I think there are countless people all around us, quite honestly, they're not antagonistic toward God. They don't hate God. You know what they're doing? They're living life. Maybe they've drifted from God. Maybe church was a reality at some point in time, and just through erosion, it just kind of no longer became a thing. But they're at a place where they just don't give Jesus much thought whatsoever. And there's a sinner who Jesus wants at the table. Also think about this, that there's a category that we will call outcasts and the overlooked. Listen, we all have a list. And if we're honest, we have people on that list that we say, no, never them. There are people on our list that, quite honestly, when we hear of them, when we think about them, we get a little bit of grr inside. It might be people of a different political persuasion as us. Might be people who hold different lifestyles than us. It might be a boss. It might be an employee. It might be just that crass person that I work with that you just look at them and you just say, no, never them. Well, the tax collectors and the sinners, they were the people that everyone else looked at and said, no, never them. But Jesus was eating with them. There's also the downcast and the discouraged. Have you ever noticed that people are angrier today than a few years ago? It just seems like people are on like that edge, and anything will push them over the edge. I'll have to admit that I was in Albuquerque yesterday, and at least once I used my horn. Terry even said, I hate it when you do that. But I read something years ago, and I'm going to hold to this as true. Anger is what is expressed when we don't know how to deal with whatever emotions are going on inside. So when we're discouraged and when we are depressed and when we are anxious and when we are lonely and when we feel forgotten, oftentimes what happens is it just comes out as anger. And I think there are people all around us that just feel beat up, that are lonely, that you're just kind of done with life because they're just so tired. And Jesus wants them at the table as well. There's another category, and I think we need to look at this and understand that we don't always put them in the category of sinners, but it's the self-righteous and the religious. So we're actually, after this series, going to go into the book of Galatians. And I think one of the messages of Galatians is that the heathen and the religious guy can be equally far from God. Because the heathen, they just use a license of free will to do whatever they want to do. And the religious guy, he's far from God, but he thinks he's okay with God because he's doing it all on his own. And they both need the spiritual healing that only the great physician can offer. And Jesus wants both of them at his table. And so I'm going to offer a few challenges here today. One is this: who is a sinner you know who needs your invitation to Jesus' invitation? Who's somebody on your list that God has put on your heart right now? As you think about this, here's just another thing, is just ask God to change your heart toward those who are on your sinners list. They're not your enemy. There is an enemy, and his name is Satan, but they are not your enemy. I'll even go as far as to say they are lost, and they're blind, and they're broken, and they need spiritual healing. Also, here's something to think about. Invite the sinner you know who needs Jesus to join you this Easter. They're in your area, they're in your network here, invite them to church. Invite them to church this Easter. They're going to hear a message that is the gospel of Jesus. I assure you of that. You know, I'm going to throw this out. I'm going to embarrass a guy in the room today. But I was in a room with a member of the church, and he said that God's laid it on he and his wife's heart to start a small group. But they want to start a small group for people who don't currently go to church. Big win. What if we had dozens of people here who said, I want to have Matthew party? So here's one more. Maybe today is your day where you say, I'm spiritually sick. I need to follow Jesus. We're going to have some people in the back. We would love to pray with you and talk with you about what that looks like. And join me in prayer.